Chapter 9. Fourth Cycle. 74 Units. Covenant Battle Calendar. Aboard Ket Pattern Battle Cruiser Purity of Spirit, in uncontrolled descent toward planet boundary. Human designation. Shipmaster Siswai Udumi awoke several moments after being knocked unconscious. The last thing he remembered was approaching the blasphemer's colony world, an alarm from his navigation officer. Then darkness. He rose from the deck and noted a sharp pain in his right leg and torso. No time to assess his personal wounds. He had half a fleet to direct and figure out what in the name of the gods had happened. He sputtered and coughed for a moment before regaining his composure. The deck was aglow with an eerie deep purple hue, the emergency power lighting. Status, he managed to bark out to his bridge crew. Shipmaster, he recognized the voice as his navigation officer. Collisions from multiple unknown sources off our starboard bow. We're moving toward the planet at flank speed now. The shipmaster clacked his mandibles in the affirmative as he shook his head, forcing his vision to clear. Raise engineering. Inform the Huragok that I want the reactors under repair as soon as we make landfall. He knew the pinch fusion reactors were drained from their jump-in system and were most likely damaged and venting precious heat and power. No longer than the words left his bloodied mandibles, several explosions rang out in a chorus of sharp staccatos, and the shipmaster was thrown across the room yet again. He struggled to gain his composure as the severity of his injuries climbed from a sharp pain in two localized areas to a searing white-hot intensity running down the length of his side. He noted that there seemed to be no fresh wounds from the second thrashing. A handful of his bridge officers did not fare as well, however. There was something seriously wrong. There was no way a simple collision would both breach their shields and do this much damage to the hull. Nothing short of the human's magnetic accelerator cannons could do this much damage in one hit. Under his feet, Udumi could feel several shudders, followed by an alarm klaxon blaring throughout the corridors beyond the bulkhead doors of the bridge entrance. Shipmaster, the infidels knew we were coming. Anne. Alarmed Sanghili reported on the navigation station. Although he attended to his duties in a desperate attempt to control their death throes through the planet's upper atmosphere, Udumi noted that it was not Sero Natum, but his executive officer. He scanned the room and found his loyal nav officer half covered by broken and mangled display monitors that crashed into his body. There was a pool of deep purple blood oozing from a head wound. He prayed that his death was swift and painless. It's a dishonorable death at the hands of a dishonorable species of worms. They've mined the upper atmosphere of the planet with their hell bombs. His executive officer spoke again with a vertical splay of his four jaws, a sign of contempt he didn't expect Siswai to see. We just hit one after the collisions knocked you unconscious. I've heard enough. I will not let this blasphemy continue any longer, Udumi said. He did not appreciate that his second-in-command had backhandedly insulted him. An unconscious Sanghili shipmaster was a weak shipmaster. He had no time for dissension among his ranks now. Open ship-to-ship communications. His replacement navigation officer ran a hand over holographic icons shaped like a set of pyramids, leaving streaks of dark purple blood smeared on the display console. All vessels, begin landing ground forces and air assault vehicles over their cities. Leave this minefield at once. Purity of Spirit will land away from the equator and farther beyond the mountain range to begin repairs. I will join the fight as soon as I am able. The communications beckoned him. Shipmaster, shouted by a stout major in deep crimson armor and tinged in obsidian black trim, signifying his association with their Special Forces unit. The reverence of divinity struck one of the human minds. Their vessel was on our starboard side and took the blunt of the blast as well. While the Sanghili warrior was finishing his situation report, Shipmaster Udumi looked out the primary display port, displaying the tactical situation as the data became available from the fleet's sensor systems. On screen, he saw a bulbous battle cruiser the size of a finger, venting atmosphere and tilting to its port side. As the ship began to stabilize and recover, a good sign that the shipmaster had things under control. A brilliant light erupted from starboard and amidships. A shockwave of flame emanated from the narrow part of its two-headed shape and snapped the divinity's superstructure in two. Shipmaster, it appears the human vessel used their magnetic accelerator cannon after the divinity's shield became crippled, the Major Sangheli said plainly. He increased magnification on the obliterated vessel and saw two human vessels barreling toward them. One was of a typical destroyer-class design, not larger than a corvette in his own fleet. The other had him worried. Almost. He thought to himself. Even their larger carriers were no match in a prolonged naval engagement against the might of a Covenant battlecruiser. A flurry of missiles, light pinpricking from the corona of their propellant boosters, began careening past the reverence of divinity as the two vessels came even closer to his own. Are shields back online yet? The shipmaster demanded. Yes, shipmaster. Shield capacitors at 9% and climbing. That'll have to do then. Increase power to best speed and set us down for repairs. Udumi finished. 9% wouldn't get them far, but it would give them enough time to enter the planet's lower atmosphere. Safe from their orbital hell mines. As the missiles continued to soar across the inky void of space between the craft, Purity of Spirit's point defense plasma projectors began to eliminate clusters of munitions. 9%, he said again. Hopefully enough to absorb the explosive force of their flurry missiles. The humans preferred to send many of these bombs en masse to try and overwhelm their positions. Purity continued to groan and shudder as it entered the planet's stratosphere. The forward display flickered for a fleeting moment and blacked out. The prow must have taken damage as well. Even with the intense heat of planetary re-entry, the nanolaminate hull plating augmented by their fleeting shields would keep the sensor arrays intact and functional, including his cameras. As the remnant of the vessel's shields glowed to a lustrous silver tinge. Shipmaster Udumi noticed the remaining handful of missiles closed the distance across several leagues of empty space to strike. At once, the first volley of missiles that escaped their point defense weapons path impacted the remainder of his shields, collapsing it with a ball of fire on the starboard side. Then dissipated. Not 2 breaths later, the final volley impacted their bare hulls. Exploding hangar bays and airlocks sent a flurry of flotsam and debris into space, and the atmosphere began expelling from the ragged tears in the skin of the ship. Raise our remaining battlecruisers. I want those human craft targeted at once. Release plasma torpedoes. Once the threat is neutralized, I want them in orbit over the city, Udumi commanded. The order was relayed to his subordinate vessels, and they began to change their approach vectors. As the human carrier and destroyer let loose another volley of missiles from their lateral lines, another magnetically accelerated slug narrowly missed the lead Covenant craft. Before the Covenant warships were even in position, they fired plasma torpedoes and energy projectors at near point-blank range. The massive magnetically aligned plasma projectiles missed their intended target and careened off towards the direction of the planet's moon. It seemed that the human commander's strategy was to get so close in a hit-and-run tactic that they would both catch his forces off guard and get away before they could react to their presence. One cruiser was able to score a single hit on the nearest human ship. In the blink of an eye, the sleek black destroyer lost several decks of its soft underbelly. The weak and archaic metal alloys the humans employed on their vessels was laughable in comparison to the might of their technologically superior plasma-based weapons. Each cannon utilized a slurry of superheated ions to form a pool of plasma, suspended in magazines until discharged. Once the formed sphere of plasma exited the vessel, magnetic projectors would keep the slurry of particles coherent in a tight projectile until it impacted its target. The destroyer began spinning in a barrel roll, reminding the Sangheli of the death roll common to a reptilian species found in bodies of fresh water in Sanghelios. It spiraled and accelerated in such a way to snuff out the oxygen in its compromised hulls, staving off the destruction of more hull sections in a vain attempt to save its own crew. The other vessel he classified as a mega-carrier in his mind proceeded to screen the remaining plasma impacts. Although they didn't score direct hits, it effectively deterred the pair from another devastating magnetic accelerator cannon attack while they inserted to the planet's surface. Shipmaster, the rest of our vessels are now breaking contact and entering the atmosphere. The last volley of missiles from the infidels knocked out our shields. The plating on the hull should hold through the atmosphere, his intelligence officer reported. Now that the reverence of divinity was avenged in kind, the human vessels increased their speed and began to run away. A cowardly tactic, to say the least. Shipmaster Udemy splayed his mandibles in disgust as he watched them accelerate past his aft view screen. A meager 10,000 kilometers away, but his ship was in too much disrepair to finish them off. He continued to track the pair as the prow of the Purity of Spirit's hull warmed from a dazzling silver to a deep, burnt orange. As they continued to increase their speed and beginning to crest the horizon of the planet, a notification rang on his tactical display. It seemed that the humans were not as brave as they tried to project. The illuminated glyphs in front of Udemy showed a radiation spike imperceptible to his eyes. Now that they were in atmosphere, he no longer had a physical line of sight on the craft. The humans entered slipspace and disappeared into the void of a dimension he could not follow. Shipmaster Udemy continued to study his display to ensure the humans weren't going to try and pull any more tricks. It was well known of the treachery they wrought, often resorting to cowardly, dishonorable tactics, like what he just endured. Satisfied that they weren't coming around for another pass nor expecting reinforcements to arrive, the Sangheili turned his attention once more to captaining the Purity. The bridge was still illuminated with a dark purple. Alarm klaxons continued to sound. But otherwise, the remaining bridge crew were hard at work ensuring they would not simply crash upon the craggy ground beyond in a ball of fire. As they barreled through the upper stratosphere of the planet, he raised the other two battle cruisers left in his command. "Position yourselves over this city," Udemy commanded. This was naught but a setback. The heathen humans are nothing to the gods. Begin your air and ground assaults. I will assemble my convoy as soon as I can. He walked over to the intelligence officer's station, careful not to apply his full weight to his right leg. There was a slight trickle of blood emanating from a jagged wound on his quadriceps, he noticed, and quickly wiped it away. He would show no more dishonor this day from humans or otherwise. In Sangheili culture, to lose one's blood was a mark of shame and weakness. He would personally tend to his wounds at the first available opportunity in his private quarters. "Shipmaster, we will land at our destination in a few moments. There appears to be no anti-aircraft emplacements. Our landing will be swift," his intelligence officer noted, sensing him more than looking at him. He dared not let his focus wander elsewhere after the embarrassing showing thus far. They were allowing the humans to dictate their actions when it should have been the other way around. "What of the other human ships in orbit?" Shipmaster Udemy inquired. There were usually others hiding or scheming something beyond the main force, a ruse. He could think of several past engagements where hidden human vessels got the better of his fellow shipmasters. If he'd learned anything over the last nearly 15 years of fighting the godless creatures, was that what they lacked in physical prowess and technology, they made up for in tenacity and treachery. "Shipmaster, primary electronic spectrum analysis is inconclusive," his intelligence officer said. "It seems that we're being jammed. The point of origin is somewhere on the planet's surface." This was concerning for more than just the obvious. If they couldn't identify the hidden threat, then they stood a chance to take out another of his fleet. Even more concerning is the fact that they might not be able to send a warning to the rest of the fleet of particular justice before they arrived in the system. Shipmaster Udemy stood up straighter, wiping the last droplets of purple blood onto the inside of his combat harness in a useless attempt to hide his shame. "Deploy a communication node farther out the system, away from the planet's moon. Relay a message to the rest of the fleet to be on the lookout for more human vessels." While his bridge officers continued with damage control and piloting the vessel to safety on the far side of the continent-spanning mountain range before them, Siswai Udemy coordinated with Field Marshal Marava Mulkamai. Another veteran blooded by campaign after campaign against humanity, he was eagerly awaiting the promise of fresh blood for his troops located in the belly of his ship. After a tenuous few hours asleep in his quarters, Captain Fulton arose to a chime from Aretes. The miniature holographic display next to his nightstand illuminated with motes of dull orange as the abbreviated version of the avatar display quietly next to him. "Good morning, sir," Aredes said softly as to not jar the captain from his slumber. Long-range scanners just picked up a tau surge emanating on the system's far side, opposite of the Death's Hand. The AI, adorned in ancient Gaelic armor and jewelry, was alluding to the unique phenomenon that occurred when a vessel tore through the fabric of three-dimensional space and entered or exited slipspace. The action of either a Fujigawa drive or the Covenant's pinch fusion reactors caused a massive but temporary accumulation of Einsteinian Bose particles for a few billionths of a second. If a sensor node was pointed in the right direction, in this case the support group's Clarion spy drones, then they could capture this occurrence against the cold backdrop of regular space. Captain Fulton cleared the haze from his eyes and felt around for his boots. He had slept in his service uniform to save time for this exact moment. He knew the spooks at the Office of Naval Intelligence were not often wrong. Moreover, if he and half a battle group were sent to this planet expecting trouble, he knew without a shadow of a doubt that they would find it sooner or later. He finished tying his boots, stood up and splashed some water of his face from the wash basin next to his personal stationery. Alistair wiped away the water as his gaze met his own in the mirror above. Haggard and exhausted, set in from too many deployments and too many nights on post, he pushed any negative thoughts to the back of his mind and made his way toward the bridge. "Sir, 4 Covenant battlecruisers en route to Boundary," his intelligence officer said in an alarmed tone. "They're on approach vector to the equator, most likely heading to Salvation." The next phase of their plan hinged on the element of surprise. "Are they aware of our presence yet?" "No, sir," the officer shot back. "Good. Looks like Lady Luck is still on our side for now. Raise Dunkirk and prepare for our first run." He walked away from the manned station to turn toward the center of the bridge. "Aredes, prepare the first volley of our ghost fleet," Captain Fulton commanded. The artificial intelligence was already prepared, his telemetry and calculations prepared in nanoseconds. As soon as his slow human counterpart issued the order, he would let loose a maelstrom of vacant vessels toward the leading Covenant ship. Captain Fulton turned his attention from Aredes' avatar to the forward viewport on the bridge, giving him a front-row seat to the mass of random vehicles before him. Throughout the latter part of the previous day and into the night, Aretes and his new counterpart Harvest Moon were hard at work, placing all the merchant vessels devoid of life, save for additional fuel and any spare combustible material they could find. At once he saw a chorus of flares light up on the dark side of Tarvos, an indication that each vessel was responding to the AI's commands. Aretes and Harvest Moon had done an exceptional job with the placement of the craft. Because Tarvos was tidally locked to Boundary, this meant that minimal thruster adjustments were needed to keep each craft in a geosynchronous orbit over Boundary's satellite. Each craft began to accelerate from one side of the moon to the other, accelerating to velocities that any human cargo would lose consciousness or die from physical stress. "Lieutenant Huang, pull up drone feed 1. He wanted to see the disposition of the enemy, and more importantly, wanted to observe the effects of his artillery barrage before he committed his forces. As his order was received, the spy drone's feed pulled up on the main tactical display in front of him. A few moments passed by as he saw the flares of thrust nozzles decrease in size, gradually diminishing until they were barely visible without magnification. In the distance, and contrasted by the emptiness of space, several fleeting pinpricks came into view. "Sir, all merchant marine craft continue to accelerate to Mach 9 and climbing," Aredes reported. At these speeds, the Covenant's shield technology wouldn't stand much of a chance. Although they were extremely efficient at deflecting Archer missiles and even conventional thermonuclear devices, there was no way they could stand sustained kinetic impacts from such a combined assault. This was what Captain Fulton was banking on. "Lieutenant Morales, relay to Dunkirk to fall in behind us," the captain began. "Ensign Thornton, ready Archer missile pods 1 through 6. I want a firing solution on our primary Mac as soon as we exit the dark side of Tarvos," he explained. The next part of his hit-and-run strategy hinged on the next few pivotal moments. The supercarrier and his destroyer Dunkirk left stationary orbits situated in the dark side of the moon and began to accelerate toward their enemy. Captain Fulton increased the view on his display monitor and saw the first few vessels impact on the closest Covenant battleship. Its shield dazzled a brilliant silver hue. Fireballs of white and yellow splashed harmlessly across an invisible bubble around the alien menace. He knew that a handful on their own would not be enough to deter or damage the enemy fleet, but it was a good way to get their attention. Release Archer missiles. No longer had the first volley of the Ghost Fleet struck their targets. A flurry of wild streaks escaped the missile bays of both the Defiance and Dunkirk, leaving milky vapor trails in their wake. While the two craft led the charge, Captain Fulton had ordered the rest of his quasi-battle group to remain behind in reserve with the rest of the derelict vessels. He had placed an uncertain amount of confidence in Boundary's fleet and their ability to either cripple or distract the Covenant invaders. Hundreds of missiles careened through the vacuum of space, and Covenant's point defense lasers began to heat up on their lateral lines and take action. One by one, each missile began to detonate before receiving purchase on their shields. A select few landed on the lead cruiser, screening the blasts for its sister ships. This was enough to finally make their shields waver and indicated it was time to strike. There's our chance. Target the lead ship. Ensign Thornton keyed the command into her console and loosed a 30-ton slug of tungsten. The supercarrier shuddered, and its light went dim as power was drained and diverted to the impressive weapon. He felt his crew hold their breath in anticipation, and for several moments, reality seemed at a standstill until finally the Covenant cruiser erupted into a fireball, a dazzling display against the backdrop of space. He ordered the destroyer to do the same and requested a situation report. A miss. Even at the relatively short engagement distance by galactic standards, errors still occurred. Moreover, the destroyer was not equipped with a smart AI like the Defiance was. So even with the firing solution the weapons officer calculated, it was difficult to compensate for the enemy's vessel's rapid course adjustment caused by impact and acceleration away from the task force. Nav, flank speed through their formation, Captain Fulton barked. With the screening cruiser out of play, he had hoped this would give the pair enough time to slip past the final 3 battleships and exit on the far side of the planet. The supercarrier and its solitary escort began to accelerate toward the 4 craft, and noticed that the other 3 had barely even made a course correction by the time they were nearing the minefield Captain Keller had established the day before. Lieutenant, adjust heading 115 by 797, he ordered, and cracked a sly smile. Let's give them some space. On their current trajectory, they should be hitting a snag in their approach in just a moment. Defiance started to roll on its port side and away from the planet. On its periphery sensors, one officer noticed a dazzling ball of light emanating from above the planet's equator. Sir, looks like the plan worked. 2 vessels just tripped the first of the Hornets, his intelligence officer reported. Outstanding, Lieutenant, but we're not out of it yet, the captain said confidently. While these 2 battlecruisers were tied up dealing with a nuclear explosion and several direct kinetic impacts from dozens of projectiles, the other 2 began to heat up their lateral and aft plasma lines, warming from a dull crimson to white hot. Torpedoes began to lance across the expanse between the remaining battlecruisers and the human craft, their response to Alistair's welcoming gift. Lieutenant Huang, raise the Dunkirk, initiate emergency slipspace jump out the system now, Captain Fulton ordered. The order was issued too late as the plasma torpedoes found their purchase on both vessels. At once, superheated plasma began to eat its way through their hulls like a searing hot knife through butter. Their meters of titanium A hulls stood no chance against the salvo. Lieutenant Huang, evasive maneuvers. He jogged back to his chair and began to strap in. All hands, prepare for emergency slipspace maneuver. Secure all loose gear, and prepare for emergency actions, he said over the shipwide communications channel. The supercarrier began to conduct a barrel roll in an attempt to deflect the next plasma shot, and at the same time evacuate atmosphere from the compromised hulls. A tear in space several hundred kilometers ahead began to emanate in front of the massive carrier, a singular tear in real space for both craft to enter from. The next salvo of plasma sped toward them, a collision alarm ringing across the bridge speakers. A Rates chimed in. "Sir, if my calculations are right." And Captain Fulton punched a command into his wrist display. No time to let him finish. He spared a tenuous glance at the display on his seat and saw the distance counter reach a dangerously low figure. He looked back up and said a silent prayer to whatever God would listen, not wanting to break the focus of any of his officers. The countdown continued to near zero, indicating their last moments before impact when the inky darkness of real space gave way to the nothingness of slipspace beyond. A garbled message came through the encrypted task force communications channel, but he was unable to make out which vessel it came from. Lower decks of the superstructure shuddered violently as they passed through real space and into the dark unknown.